The northern part, specifically Belém, is sort of indigenous people are mainly gathered in the north. In the middle of the country, specifically Salvador, uh, Brazil has a history of slavery, and so there's a lot of the Brazilians who are ethnically African. They live in the middle portion of Brazil, and then farther south towards Porto Alegre, you get into European immigration with German communities and Italian communities. So it's very diverse country, and Brazil also, when it comes to wealth, 80% of the wealth of the country is only allocated to like 20% of the population. So you have quite a difference between the haves and have-nots within the country itself. The first place we went to, though, to fly into Brazil is São Paulo, which is the largest city, not the world, within South America. And it also has the largest number of skyscrapers within the world. And I have a picture of São Paulo, so you can kind of see this massive city that it is. And from there we went to our first city, which is Belém, which is in the north part of the country. And in Belém we visited this place called Vila de Barca, which is built right on the Amazon River. And this community, they were starting to tear it down. And you can see some of the demolished houses, and they were building these apartments for them, which is on the right, and it's the orange buildings in the back. But in this community, they would get they would put all their waste into the river, and they would get their food from the river, and they would they didn't have electricity, so if they did have electricity, they tapped into the lines illegally. And so in the new apartments, they were going to have actual plumbing and electricity, but they were going to have to pay for those services, and these were very poor people to begin with. So it was a good thing and it was a bad thing at the same time. And then the next city we went to was Salvador, which I have a little side story that isn't really related to Brazilian culture, but more to American culture that I experienced during traveling from Belém to Salvador. During our plane ride, the plane had stopped and people got on. It was kind of like a bus. And some people got on that we could tell were Americans, and we could tell that they were a band, and they were an older band, probably from like the 80s or 70s, but we didn't know who they were. And some of them sat next to some of my classmates, and my classmates were like, okay, so what's the name of your band? And they were like, Air Supply. Tell your mom, she'll have heard of us. So we were on the same plane with Air Supply, which was kind of funny, because then we all emailed our parents, and they would type back in all caps, be like, I loved Air Supply, which was like, okay, who were we sitting next to? So in Salvador, as I mentioned earlier, it's a community that has its ties within slavery, and the building that's in the middle, that yellow building, is the market. And they were doing some renovations to the building, and they discovered that there was this basement section that had remains in it. And they looked at records, and they discovered that that's where slaves were kept before they were auctioned off or sent off. And because it's right along the coast, when the tide would rise, the water in the basement would also rise. So the slaves would be drowned in the basement if the water got too high, because they would be chained to the walls. And if we go to the next picture is also a little bit more of Salvador. It's the houses more of the people that don't have that 80% of the wealth within Brazil. And it's something that if I see a movie and it's in Brazil, I'll be like, that looks like Brazil, and it'll end up being Brazil, because that's kind of what it looks like. But also within Brazil, within Salvador itself, something that I mentioned earlier, that you think of Brazil, you think of maybe Carnival, but you might think of Rio. well, within Brazil, Salvador is like the second place for compared to Rio for Carnival. So while we were there, we got to see the preparations for Carnival because they prepare for that year round, and they have rehearsals of the concerts that it's going to be. So some of the major performers, stars of Brazil that are preparing to have concerts during Carnival are having rehearsal concerts that you can get into, which we were able to, which is an experience in itself because everybody's rehearsing the dancing that they're going to do to the music, and you're trying to figure out if you can keep up with them. The title of the class in Brazil was Religion and Culture, and specifically the culture that we were looking at were organizations or marginalized cultures within Brazil, and that specifically included recyclers, farmers, people that were in poverty and that had AIDS. And so we met with organizations that worked for AIDS prevention and AIDS education of the people, and also were sort of community outreach centers. And when we went to these places, they were kind of in the ghettos, I guess you would call it, or the boroughs, I don't know. But there wasn't a lot of kids there when we were visiting, and they said the reason that there wasn't any children there or kids our age there to meet with us was because there was violence going on in the community behind it, and the kids were hiding underneath their beds to avoid the stray bullets that were flying around. Another thing with, you can go to the next slide, with the recycling group that we met with, they're the education level of these people where they've stopped going to school is 8th grade, and they're working in conditions where they're not using any safety gear. They might be in bare feet and bare hands and no masks, sorting through garbage to find the recyclables to make their living day life. And one of the women that was working was about 9 months pregnant, and our professor who saw her thought she was probably due any day. And an interesting thing when it came to meeting with farmers in Brazil they have massive farms, like farms of small countries or small states in the United States. They're so big. And they'll have farmers, like people working on the land, but the farmer who owns it isn't really taking care of the land or really managing it. So these people who are working the land will squat on the land and petition the government to break up the farm so that they have the land to farm themselves, because they make the claim that they can do a better job of taking care of the land and environmental-wise and protecting it and not overusing fertilizers and pesticides and proper maintenance of land. So we met with a group that had done that and had sat on this 2,000 hectare farm for 10 years before they actually were able to have a community and farms of their own. And because these people, these groups are sort of the marginalized sections of society, particularly within Brazil, coming out of the liberation theology, which is part of the Lutheran tradition, because I was there with being hosted by the Lutheran Church throughout this country. You'll see people with black rings, kind of like what I'm wearing, and it's made from a small coconut that's within Brazil, and it shows solidarity with those people because they are the poor and the sort of outcast